Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. I just finished his book this morning. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend you read it. I was not very knowledgeable about UFOs. I can't say it's my expertise, but I really felt like this advanced my understanding of the field. The title of the book is The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. And I remember seeing John Mack's videos on YouTube. I found him to be an interesting character, and he really is a fascinating person. And the author of the book is Ralph Blumenthal, and he just published this book February 21st, 2021, so I'm delighted to have him. Ralph has written 6 books. He was a New York Times reporter from 1964, serving as a foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, and Cambodia. He was the national bureau chief in the Southwest and an investigative reporter and arts writer. He was a member of the Metro Desk that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 1992 truck bombing of the World Trade Center, so he has something in common with John Mack. In 2017, he and 2 colleagues broke the story of a secret Pentagon program to track UFOs with videos of encounters between the objects and Navy pilots. He is a recipient of the well-regarded or coveted Guggenheim Fellowship, the author of, like I said, 6 nonfiction books, and a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the University of New York. And his books are, the title of those books are The Last Days of the Sicilians at War with the Mafia, published 2012. Miracle at Sing Sing, How One Man Transformed the Lives of America's Most Dangerous Prisoners, 2005. Stork Club, America's Most Famous Night Spot, from 2000. And then Once Through the Heart, a police detective's triumphant struggle to rescue his daughter from drugs in 1992. And so I just learned a lot from this book. John Mack is a very interesting person. So Mr. Blumenthal, can you talk, for people who may not have, you have a lengthy background, but for people who may not have heard your name, can you talk a little bit about how your interest in John Mack developed and led to this book, please?
Sure. Thank you, by the way, for having me on, William. It's a real pleasure. I came to the subject like you, pretty cold, without a lot of background, and like John Mack himself. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, highly esteemed. He had won a Pulitzer Prize doing a psychobiography of Lawrence of Arabia. He'd gone to the movies to see Lawrence of Arabia, and he came out and said, I got to learn more about this guy. And he spent 12 years investigating Lawrence and writing a biography that won the Pulitzer Prize. So he was a pillar of the Harvard establishment. And through a series of steps that I can outline later in more detail, he learned about the whole phenomenon of alien abduction, ordinary people who encounter UFOs, encounter beings, are beamed aboard their ships for various pseudo-medical experiments, other strange events, possibly reproductive procedures to produce a hybrid race, by their accounts. And so he heard about this and he set about investigating it by interviewing these people, studying them with all the tools that a psychiatrist has at his disposal. And he wrote 2 best-selling books about it, got in trouble with Harvard as a result. And that's the short version. Now, I got involved because I came across one of his books. I was a correspondent in Texas for the New York Times. And in 2004, I picked up his second book, Passport to the Cosmos, which talked about his research. And I was amazed that a Harvard psychiatrist would be interested in alien abduction. I thought, well, this would make a great story for the Times. I was very naive. I had no idea how famous he already was. He had already been in the New York Times. He'd been on Oprah. He had been, a real celebrity, but he never crossed my, radar screen. So I was going to call him up and see if I could interview him. And then I found out, picked up the paper a few days later, he was dead. He'd been run over in London, almost 75 years old, looked the wrong way down the street, got run over by a man who had too much to drink. So that's what got me started. And I spent 16 years on the book because it took a lot of investigation. I had access to all his private journals and his audio tapes and, all the records he accumulated in the course of his career. So it was a long slog.
And it's really, I think the context of your book, you have a broad frame of reference in the book. So I learned a lot about ufology. Can you talk about Mack, like how he developed? Because he was part of this very prestigious academic environment, and he wasn't really that much of, he was not kind of like that conservative in his outlook. He had very different interests, I think, which led him into ufology. But can you talk about how he developed his outlook, and also his Lawrence of Arabia book?
Yeah, he what I lay out in The Believer is a series of stages that took him from really a very conventional, although wealthy, upbringing to being this real renegade researcher. And it was actually a series of things that got him there. It didn't happen, overnight, and it didn't happen suddenly. It was really a progression. So he was brought up in a very conventional German Jewish household. His religious, and if non-family didn't believe particularly in any supernatural things, including religion. And he, when he went to Harvard to study medicine, he went early into psychiatry because this is a very important part of his story. He lost his mother at 8.5 months old. His mother died of appendicitis, and penicillin had been invented, but not yet in general use, so they couldn't save her. So he was very traumatized by the loss of his mother. His father remarried pretty soon, a woman with her own sort of tragic story, but it became John Mack's stepmother. But he always felt something missing in his life. So that's the first thing you have to know about him, that he was searching his whole life for something lost, something missing. And he found it, he thought, in the search for intelligent life in the universe, that there was something, beyond the ordinary. So the series of steps were, at Harvard, he became very interested in social justice. He worked to bring mental health care to Cambridge, which was then Cambridge Hospital was a downtrodden, part of Boston. He brought mental health services there. He demonstrated against nuclear weapons. He thought, as a doctor, nuclear weapons would eventually kill off, humanity if they weren't controlled. So he was arrested in Nevada demonstrating against nuclear weapons with his family, with his wife and 3 sons. Then, as I said, he wrote the book on Lawrence, and suddenly that made him an expert in the Middle East. So you'll notice that all these things I've described until now had nothing to do with UFOs, right?
Right.
So, he went through the Middle East trying to bring peace to the Arabs and Israelis. He met with Yasser Arafat, and
he kind of mixed with a lot of different people.
A lot of different people, and he was known as a peacemaker, a very interesting character in the Middle East. But again, nothing to do with alien abduction and nothing to do with UFOs. So the important thing that happened is he went out to California, to Esalen, which is that great psychic think tank on the Pacific, and all kinds of experiments with drugs, which he sometimes participated in. And he got interested in something called holotropic breathing, which was a way of controlling your breathing to bring you into elevated states of consciousness. It's sort of like drugs without drugs. So he practiced this breathing discipline, and he found he was taken back to his childhood. He felt himself being born in the womb, coming out, his mother turning blue. He thought he felt he was in a previous life as a Russian peasant in medieval Russia. His son was being decapitated by the Mongols, and he came out and said, "Wow, this is amazing." And as he said later, that opened up his psyche, and the UFOs flew in. It's a great line, right?
And it's interesting because as a very kind of conventional psychiatrist at this prestigious university, he had kind of a new agey element to his personality, that he was kind of a seeker, and he was with Werner Erhard, Est, and he was really willing to look into those things.
He was. And, I should mention, of course, that he was very good looking. He was tall, bright blue eyes, cobalt eyes. kind of a leathery skin, rugged, physique, rugged complexion. Women and men were drawn to him. He was very charismatic, which helped. And he wasn't concerned much about, whether he would lose friends, by pursuing the strange path. He had a lot of confidence. So that's something, important to know about him. So at one of these breathing sessions, he encountered a fellow psychiatrist who told him stories about a patient of hers who seemed to have been abducted or had an abduction experience. And John Mack had read a book that somebody gave him at one of these sessions about abduction. So he was a little bit prepared, but he was very skeptical. And when this fellow psychiatrist said, I have a friend who's, studying this stuff. He's an artist. He hypnotizes people. Would you like to meet him? And John Mack said, hell no, it's too crazy for me. So he was not set up for it. He was still sort of resisting this. But then, as I say in the book, one of those very strange things that happened in life, he found himself in New York. He decided to give this guy a call. The guy was Bud Hopkins, who's a famous name in ufology and alien abduction. He was an artist who got interested because he once spotted a UFO, and he decided to investigate. And he wrote a book long before John Mack ever got involved on missing time, on how people who are, who encounter UFOs and alien beings suddenly find they've missed a few hours they can't account for, and then under hypnosis the experience comes back to them that they were taken aboard a ship and they were subject to this and that. I mean, that's the story they tell. So Bud Hopkins knew this stuff. John Mack didn't. John Mack went out to visit him. He was in New York. Bud Hopkins was in New York, and Bud Hopkins gave him a bunch of letters from people who had stories like this and said, you're the psychiatrist. You look at these letters and see what you think. So the short, version is he looked at the letters and he was blown away, as we all are when we read these accounts. How could this be? This is impossible. And yet these people, John Mack found, were normal in every other way. I mean, he was a psychiatrist, so he knew when people were crazy. He knew when people were deluded or making up stories or trying to hoax him, except once he was hoaxed. That's a separate story. But basically, he said these stories are too authentic and real to be completely fabricated. So that's what got him started.
And I mean, from the beginning, he kind of knew he was in kind of murky waters. Like he was going to have to. I think he anticipated he was going to have trouble. Maybe what happened to him, not the totality of that, but I mean, I think that from his background too, people thought, questioned his sanity, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is at the very end, when they had a memorial service for him, one of his friends stood up in the church and said, John's last words to me were, "Tell them I'm not crazy." And nobody ever thought he was crazy. I mean, they thought, maybe he was definitely naive. He was over enthusiastic. He was passionate, as the subtitle of the book says. He had flaws. I mean, he was not a perfect human being. He made mistakes, but he was very rigorous in his research. He was always looking for a better explanation. I mean, that's interesting to know. He didn't just accept these people's stories. He kept looking for another explanation, and he never found it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he in his view was that it's happening. He didn't really know why, but he did kind of explain like the phenomenon was real. Like he had so many different people and stories. I kind of felt like it was like the preliminary story of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where he was traveling around the world interviewing people from different societies, Africa, things like that. He went to the Dalai Lama, right? So
right. Yeah, he did encounter this everywhere, all over the world. And so here's the thing that swayed him early on. First of all, he saw that the stories came from a wide cross-section of humanity, not just certain people. There were housewives and police officers and psychiatrists and professional people, blue-collar people, men, women, and even children as young as 2 years old. And when a little kid, barely able to talk, says, "Little man, take me up into the sky, a little man fly me in the sky. Now, that kid is not referencing books he's read or movies he's seen. I mean, that's something the kid somehow has come up with. So that was interesting to John Mack, that, everyone was basically telling a similar story, but the stories were different enough. So it wasn't like, everybody was reading off one script. And there was fragmentary evidence, actually. People had scars that they couldn't explain afterwards, marks on their body. In one case, it was a quadriplegic who was paralyzed. He couldn't move, and he had these scars on his body that he couldn't have inflicted himself. There was evidence sometimes of a UFO landing outside. The grass was pushed down or trees were clipped. So all these things together, made John Mack think that the stories sort of hold up. The only problem is that nobody could prove it, but there was no other explanation.
And he kind of befriended and became kind of a part of some of these experiencers' lives, and really was like that picture of Mack with Whitley Strieber and Lawrence Rockefeller was incredible to me. Like, wow. And Can you talk a little bit about how Lawrence Rockefeller was involved and Whitley Strieber was involved in his life and research?
Yeah, well, Whitley was one of the first people to publish an account of alien abduction. Actually, his account was so strange that you almost couldn't call it alien abduction. And that was another aspect of this that struck John Mack, that the accounts didn't all, there was things that happened that didn't fit the conventional narrative. Not everybody was taken aboard a spaceship and, women had their eggs removed and men contributed sperm and, they were producing a hybrid race. I mean, that's one story. But some people were never put aboard a spaceship. They just encountered strange beings. They encountered reptilian beings. Where did they come from? Giant insects. There were, different races of alien beings. There were short grays and tall doctor types. And so there were things that, just seemed totally wild. And Whitley's experience was like that. So John Mack was drawn to that. And Lawrence...
please continue, sir.
No, I was going to say that Lawrence Rockefeller was a billionaire. He was a great-grandson of John D., and he was known for funding anomalous research. He was very courageous in that he ventured into areas that other, prominent
right. So
other prominent philanthropists wouldn't go to. So he became a big supporter of John Mack. Actually gave him a lot of money for his research. And one of the pictures I have in my book shows Lawrence Rockefeller and Whitley Strieber together with John Mack at a conference.
That's remarkable. And then Whitley Strieber wrote Communion, and there was that element in those stories, the experiencer stories, where it's almost like a religious transformative experience for some of these people. They weren't all terrified. Would you talk a little bit about that, about kind of how these people felt after it happened to them?
Yeah, this is interesting because John Mack differed from Bud Hopkins and another prominent researcher, David Jacobs, who also, he was a professor at Temple University who looked first into the UFO phenomenon and later on into alien abduction. And Jacobs and Hopkins were much more tied to the idea that these aliens were, first of all, was happening in reality. It really did happen physically to these people, number one. Secondly, it was mostly a traumatic experience because the aliens were trying to take their DNA and create a hybrid race or whatever, but it was a terribly traumatic experience. John Mack found that it was traumatic, but the experiences also emerged transformed. They had more of a feeling for the earth, protecting the earth. They became more, religious in the sense that they were aware of a deity, some benign power in the universe, and they often felt transformed by these experiences. They didn't come out only terrified, but they also felt that they had a mission now to do something for the earth, for humanity. So and that was kind of controversial because some people said he was sugarcoating the experience, and he was putting his own feelings onto these experiencers. But that was a big difference between him and the others.
Right, and that was one of the elements of contention was he supposedly implanting these ideas in the experiencers because he had an interest in it, or were these happening independently? Yeah.
That became a big issue in hypnosis in general. Was the hypnotist projecting his or her, ideas on the subject? And there's a lot of misinformation about hypnosis. It's very mysterious, and it's not accepted in courts of law, for example, because it's just too unformed and people don't have a clear idea. But John Mack always felt that people under hypnosis were not imagining their experience. They weren't getting implanted ideas. These were too central to what had happened to them to be anything but real memories. Now, some other scientists differed somewhat, and they said that no, these experiences could be suggested to them and implanted, and they didn't actually have them necessarily, but it was the way the question was asked and the way they were led. So that's an ongoing controversy in psychiatry.
Right, and you brought up the McMartin case and some of these other instances where the patient subject and the doctor, the interests melded, or that. But he wrote those two books. He was also interested. I mean, it's not just the Lawrence, but he made interesting decisions. He had your research seemed to have that all the information that he had from his therapist. He chose the Sikh psychotherapist. I thought that was an interesting element.
Yeah. This is really one of the things that I'm proudest of in the book, that I got access to his therapy sessions, not all of them, but some of them. And John Mack was a compulsive saver. He saved all his drafts and everything he wrote, his journals where he recorded his most private thoughts, and the family gave me access to this material. Now, among the material were tapes of the sessions that he had with his therapist. Psychiatrists have to be analyzed more than anybody else because that's one of the requirements in psychiatry. You have to go through a long analysis. So even after he was a professional psychiatrist, he still went for analysis, and he would talk to his therapist, who was a Sikh and a very up to the minute guy, very hip and very cool. I've talked to him for the book. Gurucharan Singh Khalsa is his name. And John didn't hold anything back. He was talking to his therapist. He talked about his love life. He was interested in some other women besides his wife because he was always searching for, that missing woman in his life ever since his mother died. So he would confide his marital problems. He would confide his frustrations with his research. And it was a real window into his mind.
Yeah, I mean, really fascinating stuff. And he also kind of had troubles with the media, with Oprah Winfrey, with some interviews. Can you talk about his difficulties trying to relay his research to the greater public?
Yeah, he, as I said before, he was naive. And when he sat for an interview, anybody who knows how the media works, and I spent 45 years at the New York Times, so I know that you have to be careful around journalists, and you have to sort of know in advance what you want to tell them, what your story is. But he would try to make friends with everybody who came to interview him, and he would say things like, I don't know, should I talk about astrology? Yeah, maybe I won't talk about astrology. Well, you don't do that to a reporter. You don't mention drugs and then say you're not going to discuss drugs. So he was naive, and he actually brought some of his experiences onto TV shows with him. He was so bent on explaining the important story that he had stumbled onto. He was so enthusiastic about it. He wanted to showcase his experiences, and they trusted him, and they went along with him, and they appeared on Oprah and other shows. And as he said after one show, we got sandbagged because the the shows, their interest was to extract the maximum emotion and entertainment value out of this. And they would egg on the people and say, what do you mean this can't be true, and it put them on the spot. TV is not a very good medium for discussing subtleties, in case people haven't noticed. So it was kind of a debacle. The Oprah show was pretty good. I'm not saying that she didn't do a very good job. She did. She was skeptical, but she was also open to hearing the experiences, but others weren't as good. And so he did get sandbagged, and the experiences were made fun of, and they were held up to ridicule, and he was held up to ridicule. So that was a problem. And at one point, as I said earlier, he was hoaxed by a woman who came forward and told a fantastic story, supposedly, that had happened to her. She said she was on a spaceship during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, and President Kennedy were both on the spaceship, and Khrushchev was crying in her lap. And John Mack thought that was amazing. After the stories he had heard, that wasn't so crazy. But it turned out later that she told Time magazine she made that all up because she wanted to expose him. She said he was a cult leader and things like that. Well, the truth is, as I outline in my book, John Mack thought she really was an experiencer, and there's reason to believe she really did have these experiences, and she pretended to be a debunker for reasons of her own. But it was a sad episode.
And I don't think that's uncommon in the UFO community. I think there's a lot of people with different agendas that may not be telling the true stories too for their own personal interests. I don't think that you would be alone. But he also kind of had trouble with his peers like Carl Sagan and some of these other people in that environment of like the cosmos or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about how they received his books and stuff?
Well, his colleagues many of them were very skeptical. I mean, they came from a very conventional background, Harvard, even though Harvard, was no stranger to unconventional research. I mean, William James, the father of psychology, was, talking about seances at Harvard 100 years before Mack. But in more recent years, it was certainly controversial to talk about, aliens and UFOs at Harvard, and to give them the kind of credibility that Mack gave him. So he had pushback from some of his psychiatric colleagues who thought he was enabling the people he was seeing. They thought he should have been more skeptical and not subscribe to their stories, but he, as I said, he ended up believing that they had encountered something real, even though it was not necessarily in this reality. It was not everyday reality. It was some other liminal state that these things were happening, but they were happening, he thought, to these people. They weren't lying about it. So he had pushback from colleagues. Some supported him. They thought he was courageous. That he was, opening up new areas of psychiatry. So it was a mixed bag.
Yeah. So some people really saw him as kind of a pioneer and groundbreaker. The others thought he was involved in kind of charlatanism or something like that. But those stories are for differing stories. There's a lot of really true stories about those UFO experiencers. But he did have he had trouble with Harvard and involved some well-known figures like, Daniel Sheehan of the Christic Institute. Can you talk about how that played out? Yeah.
So he was always worried. I mean, he made no secret of his research at Harvard. Actually, before he even knew very much about the abduction phenomenon, he was already talking to audiences at Harvard about it as he was learning, as he was, embarking on his research, which probably was a mistake. He had been cautioned about not jumping the gun, but that was his way. He was quite enthusiastic. So he couldn't wait to tell people of what he was finding. So, and he kept thinking, gee, I got to tell Harvard officially what I'm doing, but he kept putting it off. And finally, he decided he's going to talk to the deans of the medical school and tell them about all this research. But they were ahead of him, and they handed him a letter before he even opened his mouth and said, "John, we're investigating you," essentially. Now they said it was not an inquisition. So of course he being a psychiatrist said, "Well, why would you use a word of something that it isn't?" So it was an inquisition in his mind, and I said in the book that there's reason to consider it an inquisition. It was secret. It was designed to bring him down. It was very intrusive. It questioned his beliefs, his financial situation. It really probed very intrusively into his life, whether he believed in UFOs, whether they were real, all these other questions. So he was under investigation for a year and a half. But when he first went in there to the committee, he thought it would just be a conversation, with his colleagues, that they would ask him questions and he would respond. He had nothing to hide. And his nephew, who was at Harvard Medical School, a physician, heard that, John, his uncle, was going into this committee without representation. He said, "You got to be out of your mind. You need defense. You can't just go in like that. You need a lawyer." So he first got a lawyer who was connected to Harvard, which was not a very good idea. Again, it was his naivete. And then he got, as you said, Danny Sheehan from the Christic Institute, a real firebrand, lawyer who he represented Karen Silkwood family and her, after she died mysteriously, their lawsuit against the plutonium, plant where she worked. He investigated the Iran-Contra arms scandal under the Reagan administration, the Ku Klux Klan. So he was one firebrand that John got as his lawyer, and the other was Eric McLeish, who had investigated the priest abuse scandal in Boston. He just come off that, and he, that was in the Boston Globe movie, the Spotlight.
Right.
And he was a real celebrity as well, McLeish. And there were two really hotshot firebrand lawyers, and it was just what Mack needed to fend off Harvard, because Harvard was very powerful and they had their, legal team and all of the power of Harvard. So, but he put up a very good defense. And the whole story of the investigation was never revealed, except I have the papers in my book because I got them from his archives. Harvard never issued a report, laying this all out. It was never officially, disclosed. They just put out a statement at the end saying he was basically exonerated. No legal action would be taken. But I'm happy to say that I was able to, to get the story from my book. And as I say, they found that he was a little too enthusiastic. He admitted that. He said, "Yeah, I was over emotional, maybe passionate. I should have been more careful." But he didn't do anything wrong. They found no, egregious, missteps, and basically he went on from there.
Yeah, but it's interesting too, because people perceived him, at least Sheehan did, perceived him as one of these groundbreaking figures of somebody. Like, he put him in the place of Galileo and Darwin, people who were pushing human understanding forward. So at least that's what he wrote in his document. Sheehan did. And also, like you mentioned, William James, but also kind of other thinkers, Jung, Freud, Conan Doyle.
Yeah, he was, his lawyers certainly put him right up there. And John Mack always said that this is really the fourth wave of human understanding. First, the early humans thought that the sun revolved around the earth. And then they found, no, it doesn't work that way, And then they thought God just created humans, from spirit, nothing. And they said, no, it's actually a process of evolution. And then people thought that people were masters of their own mind. They ruled their impulses. And then Freud came along and said, actually, no, you're really a victim of your darker impulses and your secret yearnings and all these things that are going on, churning around in rain. And then the last frontier, Mack said, was, we're alone in the universe. We're the only intelligent life in the universe. And now we're finding, well, that's probably not true. There's billions. There's billions and billions of planets, and there's probably life of some kind elsewhere in the universe, almost certainly. And given that the universe is 13 billion years old, probably life has had a chance to evolve in some very complex forms in other places. So that's, what he said was the progression. And people like Danny Sheehan said, well, that puts John Mack up there with Galileo and Darwin and Freud, which is very flattering to him.
Yeah, and I mean that's what sets him apart is really just this very prestigious, accomplished academic venturing into this. Really is, I think, important for people because they can get a well-seasoned, intelligent, experienced psychiatrist to look into. It gives the whole environment credibility when there's a lot of. I think it's you even mentioned in the books like a lot of kooks and myth making and things like that.
Well, it's a good point you make, William. He was just the right man for the job because he was a towering intellect. If somebody with half his ability had been in the same spot, I don't think he would have been able to carry the argument as well. But Mack, for example, he had written a very good book on nightmares. So later on, people came and said, "Well, these people, they're just suffering a nightmare." He said, listen, I know nightmare. I studied nightmares. He was an expert in nightmares. He was an expert in childhood development. He had written about a book about a teenager who committed suicide. He had written a book about different aberrant states in psychiatry, people suffering all kinds of mental disorders. So he had covered that ground to the point where he could say, look, I'm an expert. If you're an art dealer and or an art specialist and someone shows you a portrait and says, this is by Rembrandt, well, whether they're telling the truth or not. You have ways of checking that out. And he said, I'm the same way. He didn't say that in an arrogant way, but he just said, look, I know when people are lying or they're making stuff up. And these people are not crazy. So he really brought a lot of weight to the field.
Right. And do you think that his research or his Pulitzer Prize winning book on T. Lawrence, and you mentioned Campbell, also kind of this heroic, the heroic ideals. Do you think how much of that influenced his research and him as a person?
Another good question. He took Lawrence as his role model, actually. And that was another perhaps flaw in his character. He saw himself in somewhat grandiose terms because Lawrence obviously was a nation builder. He was a fabulous character who, unlike the movie, by the way, he was not a sadist. He was not a warmonger. He was a very private, shy almost person who didn't even like to use his own name. He liked to disguise his legend with another name because he didn't want the spotlight. Anyway, but he was extremely heroic. He mobilized, Arab tribesmen in revolt against the Turks. And and John Mack, studying Lawrence, and John Mack studying Lawrence for a dozen years the way he did, he saw himself sort of in the mold of Lawrence. And later I say, he didn't say this of himself, but I say that he kind of fulfilled Joseph Campbell's, steps or guidelines for a hero. He receives a call to adventure, which is, a summons to investigate something, to do something. He tries to evade it and say, this is not true. I don't want this job, like Jonah in the Bible didn't want the mission that God, was sending him on. Yet he finally says, okay, I'll go. And John Mack does his investigation. He has many adventures along the way, life-threatening, hair-raising adventures. He triumphs, and he comes back with a gift for mankind, which is the wisdom he accumulated. And that's the definition of a hero that Joseph Campbell set out. And I find that John Mack kind of fulfilled that in his way.
I agree. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. We're at 40 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed? And also, can you talk a little about where people can get the book or your social media if they want to reach out to you?
Sure. I have a webpage, www.Ralph Blumenthal, RalphBlumenthal.com, ralphblumenthal.com, which gives my bio and my other books and tells you, how to order The Believer. It would be great if you could buy it from an independent bookstore because Amazon has enough money. I'm very grateful to Amazon for pitching the book, but independent bookstores need all the help they can get. And it's possible to get the book at independent bookstores, even if they have to order it. Amazon does have it. Barnes & Noble does have it. Sometimes there's a wait. And Kindle has it. So if you're really desperate for the book right this minute, you can get it, within seconds on your Kindle or on your iPad and read it that way. A lot of people like to do that. And there's going to be an audio book at some point, so you can listen to it.
Well, congratulations. It's an excellent read, too. I kind of felt like it was like one of Michael Crichton's best fiction movies, even though this is all nonfiction. It reads really well, so I highly recommend the book. It's superb. Again, the name of the author is Ralph Blumenthal, and the title of the book is The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. February 21st, 2021 was the publication date. Thank you so much, Ralph.
Thank you, William. A real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right.